Welcome back to The Frequency. You've tuned into Channel 19 Mysteries, and I'm your host, The Midnight Rider. We all know that when the sun goes down and the highway stretches out into nothing but blacktop and shadows, the mind starts to play tricks on you. Out here, in the dead of night, the line between what is real and what is nightmare gets a little blurry. But long before we were hauling trailers down the interstate, men were riding a different kind of beast, iron horses, screaming through the wilderness on ribbons of steel. Tonight, we aren't just telling a ghost story. We are looking at a documented piece of history from the frozen prairies of 1908. It's a tale of hard men, heavy steel, and a spectral warning that appeared on the tracks not once, but twice, a premonition of twisted metal and steam that no one could outrun. If you enjoy the ride into the darkness, go ahead and smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Tell me about the strangest thing you've ever seen in the high beams. Now, let's get into tonight's story. It floated off the tracks. There is a certain kind of profound, heavy isolation that only truly exists when you are hauling a massive load through the pitch black of the midnight hours. If you are out there riding through the dead of night, navigating a long, lonely stretch of highway with the radio quietly crackling on Channel 19, you know exactly how suffocating the darkness can be. The open road has its own hypnotic rhythm, a steady hum that lulls the mind and plays tricks on the eyes. Over a century ago, that same feeling belonged not to truckers on the asphalt, but to the men who operated the massive iron steam locomotives carving their way through the untamed wilderness. Tonight's story takes us to the desolate, windswept prairies of Canada at the dawn of the 20th century. It is a fully documented, historically verified account of a phantom that haunted the rails, an omen of doom that was witnessed by multiple, sane, experienced professionals, and a terrifying prophecy that culminated in an entirely preventable, yet seemingly inevitable, real-world tragedy. This is the story of the Phantom Train of Medicine Hat. In the early spring of 1908, the city of Medicine Hat, located in the southeastern corner of the Canadian province of Alberta, was a bustling hub of industry and expansion. It was a rugged, booming railway town situated perfectly along the transcontinental main line of the Canadian Pacific Railway. The rail yards were a constant symphony of screaming metal, venting steam, and the rhythmic, earth-shaking chuff-chuff-chuff of massive locomotives hauling freight and passengers across the vast, unforgiving North American landscape. For the men who worked these iron beasts, life was physically punishing and inherently dangerous. Operating a steam locomotive in the early 20th century was not simply a matter of pushing a throttle. It was an intricate, exhausting dance with a rolling bomb. The men in the cab were subjected to extreme, blistering heat from the open fireboxes, deafening noise that made communication nearly impossible, and the ever-present threat of derailments, boiler explosions, and head-on collisions. Bob Twohey was one of these men. Bob was a seasoned engineer for the Canadian Pacific Railway. He was a man who understood the language of the rails better than he understood most people. He knew the exact sound his engine should make when it was running smoothly, and he could feel a misaligned track through the heavy steel floorboards beneath his thick leather boots. He was practical, hard-nosed, and completely grounded in reality. He did not believe in ghosts, omens, or the supernatural. He believed in steam, coal, pressure gauges, and the heavy iron brake lever that kept him and his crew alive. Working alongside Bob was his fireman, a rugged, soot-stained man named Gus Day. As a stoker, Gus had one of the most physically demanding jobs in the industrialized world. His entire shift consisted of standing on a swaying, bucking metal platform, swinging a heavy iron shovel, and feeding hundreds of pounds of raw, black coal into the raging inferno of the locomotive's firebox. His face was perpetually painted with a thick layer of coal dust. His muscles ached constantly, and his eyes were always stinging from the dry, searing heat. Bob and Gus were a tight, efficient team. They trusted each other with their lives, which was an absolute necessity when you were hurtling through the pitch-black wilderness at 50 miles an hour with thousands of tons of metal rolling behind you. They worked the night shift, a schedule that suited them both. The night was cooler, the tracks were less congested, and the world was quiet. But that quiet was about to be shattered in the most incomprehensible way imaginable. It was late in the evening, on a crisp night in May of 1908. Bob Twohey and Gus reported to the Medicine Hat rail yard for what was supposed to be a standard routine run. Their assignment was simple. Take a light engine, a locomotive traveling without any attached freight or passenger cars east out of Medicine Hat to the nearby town of Dunmore. There, they were scheduled to couple their engine to the Spokane Flyer, a luxurious passenger train, and haul it westward through Lethbridge and deep into the treacherous Crow's Nest Pass. The initial leg of the journey from Medicine Hat to Dunmore was short, but it was notoriously tricky. The track was a single rail line, meaning trains traveling in both directions had to share the exact same set of tracks. To prevent disastrous head-on collisions, the railway relied on a strict, meticulous schedule, telegraph operators who communicated train movements between stations, and the absolute vigilance of the engineers. To make matters worse, the track leaving Medicine Hat did not run in a straight line. It wound its way through the rugged, uneven terrain of the Ross Creek Coulee, a deep, meandering ravine carved into the prairie. The rail line hugged the side of the cutbanks, forcing the trains to navigate a series of sharp, blind curves where visibility was reduced to almost zero. As Bob Twohey pulled the heavy iron throttle, releasing a massive plume of white steam into the black night sky, the locomotive lurched forward, slowly building momentum as it rolled out of the yard. Gus stood at his post, his shovel scraping against the metal floor as he hurled another load of coal into the roaring firebox. The intense orange glow illuminated the cramped cab, casting long, dancing shadows across their faces. For the first mile, everything was perfectly normal. The rhythmic pounding of the pistons and the steady clacking of the wheels over the track joints formed a familiar, comforting soundtrack. The night was exceptionally dark, with a thick layer of clouds obscuring the moon and stars. The only light in the wilderness was the powerful beam of their own locomotive's headlight, cutting a narrow, dusty cone through the absolute blackness ahead. They were approximately 2 miles outside of the Medicine Hat station, approaching one of the sharpest, most notorious blind curves along the Ross Creek Coulee. The track ahead hugged the massive dirt wall of the cut bank, turning sharply to the right. Bob Twohey kept his hand resting lightly on the brass brake valve, his eyes straining to pierce the darkness beyond the curve. Gus paused his shoveling, wiping a mixture of sweat and coal dust from his forehead with the back of a calloused hand, leaning out the side window to catch a brief, cool breeze. And then, it happened. As their locomotive began to round the blind curve, a sudden, blinding illumination erupted from the darkness ahead. It was a massive, searing white light, piercing through the night with an intensity that forced both Bob and Gus to instinctively raise their hands to shield their eyes. Gus squinting through his fingers, felt his heart slam against his ribs. He would later describe the light as being the size of a massive wagon wheel, burning with the intensity of an open firebox. It was the unmistakable, terrifying glare of an oncoming locomotive headlight, and it was hurtling directly toward them on the exact same single rail track. Panic, absolute and primal, flooded the cramped cab. They were on a collision course, and the oncoming train was moving at a terrifying speed. There was no time to think, no time to consult schedules, and certainly no time to stop. "Jump!" Gus screamed over the deafening roar of the engines, his voice cracking with pure terror. He dropped his heavy iron shovel, the metal clattering uselessly against the floorboards, and threw himself toward the narrow cab doorway, preparing to hurl his body out into the dark, rocky ravine to avoid being crushed in the impending explosion of twisted steel and boiling water. Bob Twohey's reaction was pure, ingrained instinct. His large, gloved hand slammed down toward the heavy brass brake valve, intending to throw the locomotive into a desperate, screeching emergency stop. But Bob's hand froze in midair. As he braced for the catastrophic impact, his eyes widened in absolute disbelief at the impossible scene unfolding through the front windshield. The oncoming train, a massive, towering behemoth of black iron and blinding light, let out a long, haunting, mournful shriek from its steam whistle, a warning blast for the curve. But instead of violently slamming into the front of their engine, the oncoming locomotive did something that defied every known law of physics, gravity, and reality. It simply glided laterally off the heavy iron tracks. It did not derail. It did not crash into the dirt embankment. It remained perfectly level, perfectly upright, and continued to rush forward, floating suspended in the thin air, mere feet to the right of Bob and Gus's engine. Gus Day, who had half his body hanging out of the cab doorway preparing to jump to his likely death, froze. His knuckles were white as he gripped the metal handrail, his jaw hanging slack as he stared out into the darkness. The ghostly locomotive swept past them in absolute, terrifying silence. There was no deafening roar of pistons, no grinding of heavy steel wheels against the iron rails, no intense heat radiating from its massive boiler. There was only a sudden, bone-chilling rush of icy wind that smelled faintly of ozone and old, stagnant earth. As the phantom engine passed, Gus and Bob looked directly into the cab of the ghost train. The interior was faintly illuminated by an ethereal, sickly, pale light. Standing at the controls were the distinct silhouettes of an engineer and a fireman. And as they passed, the spectral crewmen slowly raised their hands, offering a casual, friendly wave to Bob and Gus, exactly as real railroad men did when passing a colleague on a parallel track. Before Bob or Gus could even process the impossibility of the moment, the phantom locomotive was followed by a long, trailing string of passenger coaches. The windows of these ghostly cars were brightly lit, casting a pale yellow glow into the night. Inside the cars, Gus could clearly see the dark silhouettes of passengers, men in bowler hats, women in long, high-collared dresses sitting perfectly still, their faces turned toward the windows, staring out with blank, unmoving expressions. The ghost train rushed past them in a matter of seconds, and then, as suddenly and violently as it had appeared from the darkness, it simply vanished. The blinding light, the pale glowing windows, the massive iron bulk of the train, all of it dissolved into the pitch-black night, leaving behind nothing but the empty, silent prairie and the rhythmic chuffing of Bob and Gus's own very real engine. For several agonizingly long minutes, the only sound in the cramped cab was the mechanical breathing of their locomotive and the ragged, shallow panting of the two terrified men. Bob Twohey remained frozen at the controls, his hand still hovering over the brake valve, his eyes locked straight ahead on the empty track. Gus Day slowly pulled himself back into the cab, his entire body trembling violently, his legs completely devoid of strength. He sank down onto the hard metal floor, his back pressed against the cold steel of the tender. Neither man spoke a single word. They were two hardened, practical men of the industrial age. They didn't believe in the supernatural, and more importantly, they knew what happened to railroad men who reported seeing ghosts, flying trains, or phantom lights. They would be immediately pulled from duty, subjected to medical evaluations, branded as drunkards or lunatics, and stripped of their livelihoods. In a silent, unspoken agreement born of mutual fear and self-preservation, Bob eventually lowered his hand, grasped the throttle, and continued the journey. They pulled into the station at Dunmore, successfully coupled their engine to the Spokane Flyer, and completed their long, grueling run through the Crow's Nest Pass in complete, oppressive silence. But the silence could not hold forever. 2 weeks later, on a bright, sunny afternoon in mid-June of 1908, Bob Twohey and Gus Day coincidentally crossed paths on a bustling, dusty sidewalk in downtown Medicine Hat. Surrounded by the noise of horse-drawn wagons, shouting merchants, and the distant whistle of the rail yard, the two men stopped and stared at each other. The bright daylight offered a sense of safety that the midnight cab never could. Bob looked at Gus, his face deeply lined with exhaustion and anxiety. He hadn't slept properly in 14 days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that blinding wagon wheel light bearing down on him. "Gus," Bob finally said, his voice barely a whisper over the street noise. Did we actually see what I think we saw out there on the Ross Creek curve? Gus let out a long, heavy sigh, the tension suddenly draining from his shoulders. God help me, Bob, we did. I saw the light. I saw the engine float right off the tracks. I saw the crew wave at us. A profound, chilling relief washed over both men. They weren't crazy. They hadn't hallucinated. But that relief was immediately replaced by a deep, gnawing dread. If they weren't crazy, then what they had witnessed was real. And in the folklore of the rails, a phantom train was never just a passing curiosity. It was a harbinger, an omen, a warning of impending death. Bob Twohey became consumed by this dread. The image of the phantom engineer waving at him from the floating cab haunted his every waking moment. It preyed on his mind to such a severe extent that this highly practical, grounded man did something completely out of character. He sought out the services of a local fortune teller. He found her in a dimly lit, incense-filled room, tucked away in the back alleys of Medicine Hat. He sat across from her, his large, calloused hands resting nervously on the velvet-draped table, and begged her to tell him what the phantom train meant. The fortune teller consulted her cards, her face growing increasingly pale and drawn as she laid them out across the table. When she finally looked up at Bob, her eyes were filled with a profound, solemn pity. She did not offer him comfort. She did not tell him it was just a trick of the light. Instead, she told him that while he was currently in perfect, robust physical health, a dark shadow had fallen over his timeline. The phantom train was indeed an omen, and it was meant specifically for him. She told him, with absolute chilling certainty, that he had less than 1 month left to live. Terrified and desperate to outrun this terrifying prophecy, Bob Twohey made a drastic decision. He immediately returned to the Canadian Pacific Railway office and voluntarily booked himself off active engineering duty. He begged the dispatchers to reassign him to the safety of the switching yards, where the trains moved at a crawl and the risk of a high-speed collision was non-existent. He was determined to stay off the mainline tracks until the cursed month had safely passed. With Bob Twohey removed from the rotation, the railway needed a replacement engineer to take over his night runs. The man they assigned to the job was an experienced, highly capable engineer named James Nicholson. James, often known simply as J. Nicholson, was a veteran of the rails, a man who had seen his fair share of close calls and mechanical failures, but who possessed a steady hand and a calm demeanor. Gus Day, however, did not follow Bob's lead. Despite the sheer terror of his previous experience, Gus was a working man who needed the steady paycheck. He reasoned that the phantom train had simply been a freak, singular occurrence, a bizarre anomaly of the atmosphere, or perhaps a shared hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the hypnotic rhythm of the night rails. He pushed his fear down deep into his gut and returned to his post as the fireman. A few nights later, Gus Day found himself standing in the exact same locomotive cab, feeding the exact same firebox, rumbling down the exact same stretch of single-track line out of Medicine Hat, headed toward Dunmore. James Nicholson stood at the engineer's post, his hand resting confidently on the throttle, completely unaware of the terrifying history that haunted the heavy iron beneath his feet. As they approached the deep, winding cutbanks of the Ross Creek coulee, the familiar, suffocating dread returned to Gus Day's chest. His hands began to shake, and his breathing grew shallow. He stopped shoveling coal, gripping the iron handle so tightly his knuckles turned white. His eyes locked on the dark curve ahead. The night was identical to the first, pitch black, silent, and heavy with anticipation. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the deep, mournful wail of a steam whistle echoing through the coulee. James Nicholson furrowed his brow, leaning forward and peering out the windshield. "That's odd," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the chugging of their own engine. Dispatch didn't clear anyone else for this line tonight. Gus Day couldn't speak. His throat seized up, completely paralyzed by a terror so absolute it felt like ice water in his veins. An instant later, the darkness ahead exploded into brilliant, searing white light. The massive wagon wheel headlight of the phantom train rounded the blind curve, hurtling directly toward them at an impossible speed. James Nicholson, experiencing the sheer, unadulterated panic of an imminent head-on collision for the first time, reacted exactly as Bob Twohey had. He shouted in alarm, his large hands lunging violently for the emergency brake valve, bracing his body for the horrific, grinding impact of twisting steel and explosive steam. But Gus Day just stood there, his back pressed hard against the tender, his eyes wide and unblinking. He knew what was going to happen. Just as before, mere seconds before the catastrophic impact, the oncoming train defied reality. It silently, smoothly glided laterally off the iron tracks. It floated through the frigid night air, suspended over the rough, rocky dirt of the coulee, passing directly beside their locomotive. James Nicholson let out a strangled gasp, stumbling backward in the cab, his eyes wide with absolute disbelief as the spectral engine rushed past his window. The same pale, ghostly crew stood in the cab. The same illuminated passenger cars trailed behind, filled with the same unmoving, shadowy figures. And once again, the phantom crew slowly raised their hands, offering a silent, chilling wave to the terrified men before vanishing entirely into the black void of the prairie night. When the train arrived at the Dunmore station, Gus Day didn't hesitate. He was completely, irreversibly broken. The phantom had returned, and it had proven that the first encounter was no hallucination. It was a deliberate, targeted warning. Gus immediately marched into the dispatcher's office, his face ashen, his hands trembling violently, and demanded to be taken off the road. He flatly refused to ever ride the main line again, accepting a demotion to yard service where he would never have to face the dark, lonely stretches of the coulee. By the time the first week of July arrived, the scheduling at the Medicine Hat rail yard had completely shuffled. Gus Day was working safely in the switching yards, sorting freight cars under the bright safety of the sun. Bob Twohey was also still working the yards, counting down the days until his prophesied month of doom had safely expired. To replace Gus Day, a new, younger fireman named Harry Thompson was assigned to work alongside engineer James Nicholson. Nicholson, despite his horrifying encounter with the phantom train, had chosen to remain on duty. Perhaps he rationalized what he saw, or perhaps he simply didn't have the luxury of taking a demotion. On the morning of July 8th, 1908, James Nicholson and his new fireman, Harry Thompson, climbed into the cab of their locomotive at the Medicine Hat yard. Their assignment was familiar: take a light engine east to Dunmore, couple with the Spokane Flyer, and haul it onward. However, deep in the Medicine Hat telegraph office, a fatal, bureaucratic error was unfolding. The station operator, overwhelmed by the morning rush and a flurry of incoming telegrams, made a critical mistake. He failed to update the clearance report to note that a passenger train, train number 514, inbound from Lethbridge, was running significantly behind schedule. Assuming the track was completely clear, the dispatcher gave James Nicholson the green light to proceed eastward toward Dunmore on the single-track line. At the exact same time, miles away on the very same track, train 514 was hurtling westward toward Medicine Hat, trying desperately to make up for lost time. And sitting at the controls of train 514, his hand firmly on the throttle, was engineer Bob Twohey. Despite his profound terror, despite the fortune teller's grim prophecy, and despite his desperate attempt to hide in the safety of the switching yards, Bob Twohey had eventually succumbed to the immense pressure from the railway management. They were short-staffed, the trains needed to run, and Bob was one of their most experienced men. Believing that working a daytime passenger run was infinitely safer than a midnight freight haul, he had reluctantly agreed to take the controls of train 514, hoping against hope that he could simply outrun his fate. It was mid-morning. The sun was shining brightly over the Alberta prairie, casting long, stark shadows across the rugged landscape. James Nicholson and Harry Thompson's light engine rumbled out of Medicine Hat, picking up speed as it approached the familiar, winding cutbanks of the Ross Creek coulee. They were approaching a location known to the locals as Privet's Brickyard Crossing, a spot located approximately 100 yards from the exact curve where the phantom train had appeared to them in the dead of night. Inside the cab, Harry Thompson was busy shoveling coal, adjusting to the rhythm of his new engineer. James Nicholson kept his eyes fixed on the track ahead, the bright sunlight offering a false sense of absolute security. Suddenly, as they rounded a sweeping curve near the brickyard, James Nicholson's blood ran cold. There, barreling directly toward them on the single iron track, was a massive, billowing plume of black smoke. Beneath the smoke, reflecting the bright morning sun, was the terrifying, heavy iron face of an oncoming locomotive. This was no phantom. There was no ethereal glow, no silent hovering, no ghostly crew. This was thousands of tons of screaming, grinding steel tearing down the tracks at full speed. It was Train 514. Inside the cab of Train 514, Bob Twohey saw the light engine appear around the bend. In that split second, as his large hand slammed down on the emergency brake valve, a motion he had practiced in his nightmares for weeks, he must have realized the horrifying truth. You cannot outrun fate. The phantom train had not come to warn him to stay off the tracks. It had come to show him exactly how he was going to die. On the outbound engine, fireman Harry Thompson took one look at the oncoming behemoth, dropped his shovel, and did exactly what Gus Day had wanted to do weeks prior. Harry threw himself out of the cab doorway, plummeting through the air and crashing violently into the rocky dirt embankment, breaking bones but saving his life. Engineers James Nicholson and Bob Twohey did not jump. They stood at their posts, their hands locked onto the heavy iron brakes in a desperate, futile attempt to stop the unstoppable force of momentum. The collision was catastrophic. The two massive iron beasts slammed head-on into each other with an impact that shook the earth for miles. The sickening, deafening crunch of crushing steel echoed through the coulee. The locomotives reared up into the air like warring animals before collapsing back down in a horrific, tangled mass of smoking iron, splintered wood, and shattered glass. The boilers ruptured instantly, unleashing a localized inferno of boiling water and scalding, high-pressure steam that instantly flooded the crushed cabs. The aftermath of the crash at Privet's Brickyard was a scene of unparalleled devastation. 7 innocent passengers aboard the Lethbridge train were killed in the violent derailment of the trailing coaches. The conductor of the passenger train, a man named Mallet, and his fireman, Gray, were both killed instantly in the impact. And trapped within the twisted, steaming wreckage of the 2 locomotives were the bodies of the 2 engineers. James Nicholson, the man who had seen the Phantom's second warning, died on impact. And Bob Twohey, the man who had seen the blazing wagon wheel light, who had sought out the seer, and who had tried so desperately to cheat death, died exactly as the omen had foretold, well within the terrifying 1-month window the fortune teller had predicted. Gus Day, safe in the confines of the Medicine Hat switching yard, heard the explosive crash echo across the prairie. When the gruesome news finally reached him that his friend Bob Twohey and his former engineer James Nicholson had both perished in a head-on collision at the exact same curve where the phantom train had appeared, Gus realized the chilling, undeniable truth. The phantom train of Medicine Hat was not a hallucination, and it was not a trick of the midnight light. It was a spectral rehearsal for a tragedy that was carved into the very timeline of the universe, a dark promise that the rails eventually collected. That is the chilling legacy of the Medicine Hat collision, a terrifying reminder that some timelines can't be altered, no matter how hard we try to switch tracks. The rails, it seems, always collect what they are owed. You've been riding with the Midnight Rider here on Channel 19 Mysteries. If you enjoyed tonight's haul into the unknown, go ahead and hit that like button to keep the signal strong, and subscribe so you never miss a transmission. I want to hear from you in the comments below. Do you think Bob Twohey could have ever outrun that prophecy, or was his fate sealed the moment he saw that phantom light? Let me know what you think. And listen, the road is long and full of things we can't explain. If you have your own stories, creepy encounters, unexplainable sightings, or just something that made your blood run cold, send them to me at mycreepyencounter@gmail.com. We might just read your story on the next run. Until then, keep your eyes on the horizon and your radio on. Stay safe out there.